Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. So happy to be here with you today, and I'm happy to have with us digitally today our featured speaker, Mr. Mark Carlson. Mark, this is going to be our second time together. Unfortunately, this time not in person, but thank you so much for supporting the museum once again. We look forward to this presentation today, and to our audience at the museum and at home, thank you all for joining us and continuing to support the museum. We appreciate your interest, your enthusiasm for aviation. Let me just say very briefly, I want to say thank you, of course, to our veterans. I want to say thank you to our members, and for those that are considering membership, please do give that a serious thought. We'd love to have you as part of the museum family. You can get signed up right on the website, or and like I say, you get to participate in programs such as this one. So thank you very much, and again, please think over membership. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our featured speaker today, Mr. Mark Carlson. He's an aviation historian and author of two award-winning books, Confessions of a Guide Dog, and also one on the topic that we're going to be looking at today, Flying on Film, A Century in Aviation. I'm very excited to hear about this. I think we've all got our favorite flying movies, and Mark is kind of the aficionado of those, so we're going to get to learn some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. He's a member of several aviation, maritime, historical, and veterans organizations. He has been a contributing writer for over a dozen national magazines on topics such as aviation and military history, classic film and television, humor, and essays. He's the award-winning club president for Toastmasters International, and he is a respected public speaker on these various historical topics. He's joining us today from San Marcos, California. I thank him for his time. So here he is, Mr. Mark Carlson.
Thank you very much, Greg. Well, that sounded great. You got my introduction that I wrote down perfectly. Yeah, I'm glad to be part of this. I think Palm Springs Air Museum is one of my favorites. It's a terrific organization, and I'm glad they managed to weather the COVID crisis and keep the public informed on the magnificent aircraft and the magnificent men that flew them. And speaking of which, I love airplanes and I love the movies. I grew up watching them and I grew up building models of airplanes just like any red-blooded American kid. So as the year went on, and I've always had my favorites, movies like Tora, 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 and The Great Waldo Pepper, and The Bridges at Toko-Ri, and Wings, not just to name a few. Fantastic movies. I always wanted to know more about the truth behind the movies, not just how they were made, when they were made, and what the actors said, but some of the trivia. And that's what led to this book, Flying on Film, A Century of Aviation in the Movies, 1912 to 2012. It was a 4-year project in which I review 177 movies, telling some of the interesting aviation trivia and talking to people who had not only been involved in the making of the movies and acting in them, but also were involved in the actual events. For instance, movies like Memphis Belle and 12 O'Clock High. Talking to bomber crewmen, how much accuracy was it in it? What was it like in the real thing? What did you think of the movie? What was the best movie? What was the worst movie? Believe me, I got lots of answers. And that's what led to this book. So I enjoyed writing it, and I've enjoyed talking about it. And in this presentation, I'm going to tell you some of the trivia about, a couple of dozen of my favorites, or at least the most interesting about these films, and the background, the back behind the scenes stuff, the fun stuff. So this is it, all about Flying on Film, A Century of Aviation in the Movies. And I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much. I truly enjoyed working on this book. It was one of the most fascinating and fun projects, and all the people that I was able to interview and talk to, and all the research, and getting to watch a lot of great movies that I'd watched since I was a kid, and learning more about them. So if you like airplanes and you like movies, this is the book for you. This is the story for you. So for the next 45 minutes to an hour, I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite movies and some of the more interesting stories. This came about because back in about 2008 or so, I was talking with John Finn. He was one of the Pearl Harbor survivor. He was at Kaneohe Bay when the Japanese attacked on December 7th. and he was the oldest living Medal of Honor recipient in the country and the last surviving one from Pearl Harbor. And John and I got to be good friends through my work with veterans and my writing. And one day I asked him, "Hey, what did you think of Tora, Tora, Tora?" And he said, "Well, they did a good job with that movie. They did it really well, and they had the kid playing me in the right spot and all that, and I really liked it." And then I asked him, "Well, what did you think of the movie Pearl Harbor?" And that's when he said, "Well, the less said about that movie, the better." So that was actually the genesis of this book, because I wanted to not write a book not just about the movies and the technical stuff and the directors. I wanted to write about the story behind the movies. So many of them were historical or semi-biographical. And so I started talking not only to the people who made the movies, but the ones who the movies were about or who had actual connection to them, who witnessed the actual events in the movies, and that's what led to Flying on Film. Aviation and film have a very parallel history. They were both started at just about the same time, 1902, when Georges Méliès released Le Voyage dans la Lune, about the trip to the moon, and the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk in 1903, and they paralleled them each other all the way until they eventually met in Hollywood in the late teens and early 20s, and that's when they started to work together and to start making movies with airplanes in them. But that's what it's all about. So let's go back to one of the first great ones, Wings, 1927, directed by William A. Wild Bill Wellman. I was very fortunate to get to know William Wellman Jr., who was himself an actor and director, who told me a lot about his father and his father's aviation film. Bill Wellman had been in one of the French escadrille squadrons as an American pilot. He was credited with shooting down 3 German planes and was awarded a Croix de Guerre. He'd actually seen aerial combat. But when Jesse Lasky decided to make John Monk Saunders' story into a movie, he chose Bill Wellman. So that was the start of an incredible career, because Wild Bill Wellman knew what it looked like. And he put together a team of excellent actors and very innovative cinematographers to create Wings, which was the first movie to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. It was also the only movie to win for technical excellence, which was the forerunner of special effects. Now, because there were not too many German planes available in 1926 and 27, they started having to use whatever they could, and they used Army aircraft and the Army, which was being penny pinched by Congress, needed all the good support it could get, so they provided many of the aircraft. This is the Curtiss P-1 Hawk, which portrayed the German Albatross fighters of Captain Count von Tellermann's flying circus. The one thing about Wings that really stands out is that it was a real air movie. They filmed it in the air. There's very few, nothing on the type of process shot that we're used to today. It was a real air film. They had cameras in the air. They were filming the planes. And with the cameras mounted in front of the cockpit or behind the cockpit, you got them incredible shots. So you're seeing air combat, simulated or not. You're seeing what it looks like to really be in the air. And it's a powerful story. Even as a silent, it is still an incredibly powerful story and very, very, very eloquent. But there's one man that really deserves notice. There was a pilot named Dick Grace who'd been in the Air Service and had been flying, he'd been doing stunt flying. He was contracted to do some of the crash stunts. And their thing was, they really couldn't simulate crashes. They had to do real crashes. Now, this is one in which he was supposed to simulate Jack's crash into the at the Allied lines. And they built the plane up with a lot of extra plating inside to give him some protection. And he was supposed to crash right into a very soft part of ground in some simulated barbed wire. Well, his aim was off, and he actually struck the hard ground with real barbed wire and got himself cut up pretty bad. He did another crash of a German Fokker, one of the German planes. And when that crash happened, he broke his neck, and he spent some weeks in traction and with a brace on. But Dick Grace was one of the kings of the Hollywood stunt pilots, and he did it for many, many years. Wing was a superb film in many, many ways, and it set the standard that was almost impossible to meet and nearly impossible to break. It was so impressive that Howard Hughes, who had the Hughes Tool Company and was already filthy rich, decided to get into movie making himself, and he wanted to make an air war movie called Hell's Angels, and it was originally shot as a silent film. With all his money behind him, he created Caddo Films, and he started putting together an air force, and he collected as many original aircraft as he could, but like Wellman, he had to get what he could, and the Fokker D7, which was one of the best fighters of the war, recreated by using the Travelair, which was a 1929 Travelair, which was a very common aircraft for that era, with a little modification in the home factory in Wichita. They made it look a lot like a Fokker, and they started becoming known as the Wichita Fokkers, and they turned up in a lot of movies after that. For a time, Howard Hughes owned the largest private air force in the world, more than 80 aircraft. He didn't stint on anything. In fact, he got a hold of the one and only Sikorsky S-29 that had been built by Igor Sikorsky and owned by Roscoe Turner. It was one of the largest planes for its day, and it was used as the Gotha bomber in the film. Now, let's be blunt here. The plot of Hell's Angels is silly and mawkish, way over the top, but it's still a stunning film to watch, either in silent or in sound. Well, the two heroes of the story are flying this German Gotha bomber and are shot down. The shoot down sequence is extremely powerful. It's very realistic, and you'd never get away with it today. But as it is going down, and you're watching it on film as it's burning and going down, Al Wilson is the pilot, and he manages to get out of the plane. But the mechanic, a man named Phil Jones, did not. When that plane crashes, you're actually seeing a man get killed in a plane crash. It's a very powerful moment, especially when you know what happened. Again, Hughes didn't pull any punches. He recreated the shoot down of a German Zeppelin. This has never been done so well, either before or since. Not even the 1970 movie with George C. Scott, Hindenburg, did it well with it. This was filmed in a huge hangar and in total darkness, and the Zeppelin model, which was very large, burned up, and it was filmed from underneath, so it is literally falling on top of the camera. This is what it looks like when a Zeppelin is shot, when a hydrogen-filled Zeppelin is shot down. Well, Hughes, by the time he finished filming it, the sound era had started, and he, in order to make the film profitable, whatever that meant, he had to reshoot a lot of the scenes with talking dialogue and intersplice it with the silent dialogue, which didn't really work. But Hell's Angels is still worth seeing because of all the incredible aircraft in it. Just don't pay too much attention to the plot. One of my favorites The Spirit of St. Louis with Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart was already a combat veteran of the Second World War. He'd flown about 30 missions with the 445th Bomb Group in B-24, and he'd come home and had resumed his movie career. He was much too old to play Lindbergh, but he managed to pull it off because he had that quiet style of Lindbergh. Originally, Lindbergh and Billy Wilder wanted Anthony Perkins to play Lindbergh, but Stewart got the job, and he did a good job with it. The film is technically beautiful, very accurate. It gets a little silly at a couple of points, but they built 3 Spirit of St. Louis mock-ups, 2 of which flew and 1 was used for interior sequences. The color production by Warner is spectacular. You see the plane from the ground, what it looks like, this tiny little plane in the air, and you see it from above looking down at a vast ocean or the wide open spaces. The technical detail inside the cockpit and what Stewart is wearing, the cramped cockpit. I've been inside a Spirit of St. Louis reproduction here in San Diego, and it is a small place, and I'm not even as tall as Stewart or Lindbergh. So it is technically superb. It's definitely a movie for aviation buffs. There's no romance in it or anything like that. It is for people who love airplanes. But what you're seeing in the movie is as close as you can really get to filming The Flight to Paris. When he leans out of the window and he's looking forward towards the hills of Ireland, you can see the firing of the cylinders and behind the spinning propeller. You can see everything passing underneath it. It's technically a beautiful film. It's very well done. It didn't do that great in the box office, and it's never been a big winner, but I think it's still one of the best aviation films ever made. When the war started, Warner, Paramount, the big studios, Universal, Fox, Columbia, RKO, all got into the act with making war movies. They'd been very hesitant before we actually entered the war in fear of offending the Germans. But once the war started, once we were actually in it, all bets were off and we could do anything we wanted. And the Germans were suddenly evil, sniveling Huns, and the Japanese were little yellow monkeys. Forgive me, but that's exactly the way they were portrayed and perceived. Well, John Wayne, who was already one of RKO's biggest stars, got called in to do a movie about the Flying Tiger. Now, let's be straight. The Flying Tigers movie with John Wayne is almost entirely fictional. They don't mention Chenault or any of the Tiger aces. It's purely a drama with Wayne as Pappy Gordon trying to keep his squadron together and keep them from getting killed while they're partying and having a good time on the ground. But there's some interesting aspects of it. The P-40s used in the movie, except for the ones that are actually shown flying, which were done by Curtiss pilots over Lake Erie, painted with the shark mouth. All the rest on the ground are either models or mock-ups because, unfortunately, the Army needed as many P-40s as it can get its hands on. So they are made of wood, and they're powered by Curtiss OX-5 engines, the same things used in the Jenny. And they're wood, and so when in one shot, Wayne is walking away from the plane, smoking a cigarette as usual, which you never do around a fighter plane. His crew chief is angrily pointing out all the bullet holes, and Wayne just said, "Termites," with a little tongue-in-cheek humor. But there's an interesting aircraft in the movie. It is the transport that is used to bomb a Japanese railroad bridge in the film. This turns up in a few other movies, like Five Came Back, and it was used by Columbia and RKO for many years to come. It is a one and only Capellas XC-12. It was a Greek-born restaurateur named Socrates Capellus who wanted to get into, of all things, starting an aircraft company. So he hired some aeronautical engineers from, I think it was Caltech, that say, let's design an aircraft and market it and see if we can start a company. So this was the result. It's a very odd looking plane. It does not have many of the features that were already becoming standard on some of the 1930s aircraft, like the monomail and the Boeing 247 and the DC-1 and DC-2. Had an unusual triple tail, double-decker triple tail, and so on. But anyway, when it was first tested, the Civil Aeronautics Board said, no, this plane isn't safe enough. It's not a good design. So it never got anywhere, but it started turning up in movies. This is it in the film, although you only see it in the actual plane in taxiing shots, starting up the engines or climbing into it. But the model is used in the movie. But that is the one and only Capellus XC-12. You can also see it in Five Came Back, a really great air film, which I also mentioned in the book, with Lucille Ball. So that's Flying Tigers. Now, Flying Tigers, as I said, was almost completely fictional. Except for the name and the shark mouth insignia on the P-40, there's not much reality to it. But there was another one, God is My Co-Pilot, which is based on the book by Colonel Robert Lee Scott of Macon, Georgia, and his later time with the Flying Tigers. Scott had come in late. He was considered too old because he had spent time training pilots at the Cal Air Academy in Chino, California. By the time he actually got into it, he was considered too old to become a fighter pilot. So he started flying across the hump with transport, flying across the hump. And he actually ended up in Kunming, and he met Chennault and eventually talked him into letting him join. But at that point, the Tigers were starting to disband and be pulled into the Army Air Force. The movie is closely based on the book, with a little bit of dramatic license and a few fictional characters, but most of the characters, the pilots and Chennault, are real people. They're portrayed, and it's well done. As far as the aircraft, most of the P-40s were flying out of Luke in Arizona, Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, and also there was a reclamation depot in San Diego, and that's where they got the P-40s for the air and taxiing sequences. A couple of others are Flying Tigers movie cast-off. But as for the Japanese planes, they did what became standard, using the AT-6 to the SNJ. But unlike later movies, they didn't modify them at all. The canopy was left the same. They didn't make any changes to the cowling or the wing. All they did was paint the meatball on it. So this is one of the AT-6s used in the movie. There were 15 B-25s also used for the bombing of Hong Kong, which did happen, but not on July 4th. It actually happened in October. But it's very realistically done. Well, Scott's adversary, Dennis Morgan played Scott. Very well done, very boyish and easy to like. And his constant opponent in the sky is Tokyo Joe, an American-educated Japanese pilot with a wicked sense of humor and a penchant for witty barbs over the radio. Now, one problem with the wartime American fighter pilot movies is that the planes are much too roomy. I've been in a P-40 and I've been in an AT-6. They are not this roomy. These are like Barca loungers. There's lots of elbow room. They have plenty of room to turn around and move and so on. But while they're going through the dogfight, you'll notice that Tokyo Joe spends an awful lot of time on the radio. He's always holding a microphone to his hand. They never show any signs of G forces or blacking out and pulling out of a dive, nothing like that. He's holding the stick in his right hand and he's holding the microphone in his left hand. How come he's not handling the throttle? But that's the way American movies were portrayed in that day. And it started a penchant. Even to this day, you will find that American pilots always talk a lot more than the foreign ones. But Scott manages to finally defeat Joe, who is right on his tail, by lowering his flaps and letting Joe shoot past him, and then he shoots him down. That is a trick that was later recreated by Tom Cruise in Top Gun. Exactly, almost shot for shot, the same thing. But playing God is My Co-Pilot, it's a really terrific film, and you get to see a lot of good aircraft, a lot of good combat sequences. I'll add on that 30 Seconds Over Tokyo is also a superb film. I don't mention it in this presentation, but it is really technically well done. Amelia, one of the entries in the biography chapter. This Is Your Life, Hollywood Style. There were 4 movies made about Amelia Earhart, and the latest, Amelia with Hilary Swank, is technically the best one, although it's more about her romances than about her flying. But there are 2 really interesting aircraft that turn up, and one of them is an original flying 5AT trimotor owned by Greg Herrick. And I interviewed Greg, and he told me quite a bit about the filming of the movie and everything. The fascinating part is that this aircraft was actually flown by Charles Lindbergh. It had been flown by Floyd Bennett and by Amelia herself. So it has some real history to it. It's C-1077, I think it is. So this one has some real history to it. It is a flying Ford trimotor. And the other, one interesting point is that when they were doing the pre-production, they wanted to paint out the Ford logo on the side of the plane because they didn't want it to seem like they were advertising Ford. But Greg said, no, this is a Ford plane. We're going to leave it on there. But they finally relented, but he had to fight for it. One of the 2 reproduction planes, the first being the Fokker Friendship that she flew across the Atlantic, with Wilmer and Stoltz, turns up. It's a perfect reproduction of the Friendship, and the red Lockheed Vega that she flew on her own solar flights. This one is now in the collection of the San Diego Air and Space Museum. It's a perfect replica of her red Vega, which is the original one is now at the Smithsonian. So it is a technically accurate film. One of my favorites is The Bridges at Tokyo-ri, about the air war in Korea. I've been lucky enough to have several connections to this film because Admiral James D. Jig Dog Ramage was a close friend of mine before he died several years ago in Coronado. He was the CAG aboard the Oriskany during the filming of this movie. Oriskany at that time was still a straight deck carrier and had participated in some of the strikes on the Korean coast. But there's a few sequences in brilliantly done, well done, technically perfect. It's almost like a Navy recruiting film for carrier service. But there's a few points in there that really stand out. Is that there's one sequence in which a ship is being brought into Yokosuka, Japan, and it is fighting off a wind, and they're using lashed down Spads and or 81s, Douglas 81s, and Corsairs in order to help hold the carrier off until the tug can get her into port. Windmilling is a fairly common practice, at least at that time in the propeller to jet age. And although the CAG in the movie, Dale Lee, protests because he said you're burning up the engines and we're going to lose those engines and we're going to get pilots killed. And he protested. But Jig Dog told me that he'd never had a problem with windmill. He said, we always had plenty of engines and engines are expendable. The carrier really wasn't. So when you see windmill, you're seeing how it was actually done, but it's used more as a dramatic effect than as it was really done as a natural thing. All of the approaches, the landings, the crash landing, takeoff, helicopter rescue are done almost like it was a training film. The process shots, the process shots are beautiful. Flying the Panthers, the F9F Panthers, in the air, above and beyond above and below each other, in the airtime sequence. The attacks on the bridges are all done very, very well, except that I was told by a former um, Navy pilot named Rex Warden, when he was viewing the film with me, he said, "Well, we don't attack the bridges that way. We never attack bridges coming across them. You'd never hit a thing. You fly along the railroad and you hit them that way, or at most you fly in an oblique, but you'd never hit them across. But it's more for cinematography, and it is really well done. It's very, very realistic, right down to the sound. It has an extremely powerful effect. William Holden was the main actor, along with Frederick March, Grace Kelly, Mickey Rooney, um, Earl Holliman, and a few others were excellent in this film. But Jake Dog was the CAG, and he entertained them, and he got to know them all very well. William Holden wanted to do his own taxiing shot, and he was amazed at what the Navy did in this film, how well they did their job. So it's worth seeing. The Battle of Britain was one of the great air war movies. It's almost epic in scope, extremely well done. The British have an ability to do films a little better than the Americans because they take authenticity more seriously. They don't do a lot of talking in the cockpit, and you have to listen to them through an RT rather than open air. They use as close as possible the real airplanes. They got several late war Spitfires. They were able to get a few Hurricanes. The German planes were all owned by the Spanish Air Force and were purchased from the Spanish Air Force. The Casa 2.111 Heinkels were playing the Heinkel 111. They were real ones. One of them had actually been Francisco Franco's personal transport. They didn't get a hold of any Dorniers or ME-110s or Ju-88s. They were all Heinkel. Interesting, these ME-109s were real ME-109s, but they had a Merlin engine. And in fact, all the German planes are powered by Merlin engines. But it's still technically very well. They had 11 technical advisors from both Germany and Great Britain, all former fighter people from Fighter Command and from the Luftwaffe, so they could get technical accuracy. There's a little bit of a love story in there, but it's okay. It doesn't hurt the movie at all. It's beautifully filmed, really well done, very accurate as to what it was like for the fighter pilots on both sides. It's a spectacular film. The other picture is they could not get any Stuka. They had one original Ju-87, but it was decided it would be too expensive and risky to restore it to flying condition. So for the distance shots, they either used model or two Percival Proctors, which had that inverted gull wing, and they modified them to look like Stukas. So around the set, they were known as Pertrukas. It's an epic film and very moving, and it's probably the best that Hollywood or anybody will ever do to recreating the Battle of Britain, not like what was done in Pearl Harbor. One of my real favorites is The Dam Busters. This film tells the story about how number 617 Squadron of Lancasters bombed 3 of the big German dams in the Ruhr Valley, the Mone, the Sofa, and the Ada, using a skip bombing method with a special upkeep bomb. Well, the film shows a slightly altered version of the truth, how Barnes Wallace came up with the idea of the skipping bomb and developed it and tested it until Guy Gibson and his squadron of Lancasters made the raid in March of 1943. It is well done. They got 4 actual Lancasters, and the pilot that flew them got to do a lot of low-level stuff in recreating the raid itself. One thing that really impressed me was the sound. They did a great deal with the sound. The pilots are talking to each other over the RT. You don't hear them doing a lot of gabbing. They're doing what they were supposed to do. The pilots and the gunners are all doing their job. The bombardiers are doing their job until they're approaching the target. The startup sequences for the Lancasters, when Richard Todd as Gibson is advancing the throttle, the engines are roaring. You watch this film, crank up your speakers. This is what it sounds like to be in a Lancaster with 4 roaring Merlin engines. It gets right into your bones. It's powerful and very realistic. The nice shots, you're showing the black Lancasters flying over the channel and onto the Dutch coast and into Germany. The only weak point is that the tracers are hand animated onto this film, and it's fairly obvious, especially to today's moviegoers. And the explosions of when the bombs explode on the face of a dam, and you see this rising blast, you can see that an explosion, a smoky explosion, is matted into the blast. It's a weak spot, but it doesn't really hurt the film. It's just one of those things where I know they could have done better. I've never understood why they didn't. An interesting side note is that George Lucas watched this movie many, many times, because when he was putting together the sequence for the attack on the Death Star in Star Wars, he used many of the same angles and the way 3 aircraft would peel off and head towards the target. He used them almost exactly shot for shot, and that has been shown. You can find it on YouTube using the same footage side by side, and you can see how similar they are between the Dam Busters and Star Wars. The movie was released on the 12th anniversary of the actual day of the flight, but Guy Gibson wasn't there to see it because he had been killed in a mosquito crash in 1944. Memphis Belle. You've all heard about this movie. It came out in 1990. Great movie. But I think they could have just changed the name to Southern Belle or something else, because it really has nothing to do with the real Memphis Belle final mission. William Wyler had made a documentary during the war, really fantastic documentary, Memphis Belle, The Story of a Flying Fortress. His daughter, Catherine Wyler, who I met in Dayton in 2013, decided to produce this movie. It's largely fictional as to the Memphis. There are no actual real names used, and the plane has the name Memphis Belle, but other than that, that's fictional. The last mission that they flew, the 25th mission on March 17th, 1943, excuse me, May 17th, 1943, was far more hairy than the real mission to Lorient, which was almost a milk run. But that wouldn't have been dramatic enough for Hollywood. Technically, it's superb. Bruce Orris and Andy I think of his first name, Garcia, helped to get the planes ready, to get the interiors ready, what it really looked like inside a 1943 B-17. The actors got to know the actual air crew and learn how to do their things, how to work. For once, even though they're doing a lot of talking, it isn't like the usual B-17 movie where you can run through the plane without any problem. It shows how cramped and difficult it is to get around inside a B-17. And they also use the fact that these guys are really young. Most of the air war movies from the wartime and era and in the next 2 decades, most of the actors are too old. I mean, even like Clark Gable, for instance, are much too old for the roles. But these guys are all in their early 20s, which is pretty close. These guys were just kids. Most of them were 19, 20 years old. And even the group commander might have been no more than 23. So this shows what life was like, and I considered it, as I told Catherine Weiler, I said this is a superb film. It's the Das Boot of bomber movies. It shows what it was really like. One of the planes, they had 5 B-17. Most of them were B-17G with the chin turret removed. But one of them was an actual B-17F. It was N-17W, and it was used for the role of Seacup, the one with the generous female bosom painted on the side. That's N-17W, and it had gone through a checkered career as a cargo plane, as a fire bomber, and all that. So what you are seeing is pretty much just a shell. It was finally presented to the Museum of Flight in Seattle, Washington, and went through 17 years of restoration. It is now the most perfectly restored B-17F in the world. It is perfect down to the last detail. It doesn't fly, but you can go through that plane at the Museum of Flight and see what it looks like. Every single detail of a 1943 B-17F, so it's worth seeing. Tora, Tora, Tora. That's the big one. That's when John Finn helped me get this book started. It's got a lot of impressive aerial sequences in it. Only thing is, there weren't any Japanese planes available when Zanuck and Fox decided to make this film. So they collected 30 Japanese planes out of American ones. That's when you started to see the AT-6s and SNJs converted to Zeros by modifying the canopy, a different cowling, a three-bladed prop, and a few other things. That's so many of the AT-6s, Zeros that you saw in later movies and also in Baa Baa Black Sheep were the ones made for Tora, Tora, Tora. The Kate torpedo bombers were also AT-6s, but they extended the front cowling about 3 feet, moved the engine out. They modified it, made a longer canopy, and then took the tail off and put a BT-13 tail on it, and then put a torpedo mount on it. They looked really good. And the Val dive bombers were BT-13 with wheel spats and other modifications. They're really hard to tell from a distance that they're not the real thing. Diz Laird, Commander Dean Diz Laird, who had a 30-year career in the Navy, he was an ace with VF-4, the Red Rippers, the Hellcat pilot. A good friend of mine, he just turned 100 early this month. Told me a lot about his work on Tora, Tora, Tora. He's one of the lead pilots, one of the first ones chosen to do the flying of a Japanese plane. And he said that they had the planes modified up in Long Beach, and they flew them down to Coronado, where they were going to be loaded aboard the second USS Yorktown for the takeoff sequences. And they flew over the Coronado Golf Course, and on the course, purely coincidental, that day were 2 retired admirals, Max Leslie and Elliot Buckmaster. Max Leslie had been a commander of Bombing 3 on board the Yorktown during the Battle of Midway, and Elliot Buckmaster had been Yorktown's commander. And they saw, as aviators, they looked up when they heard planes flying over, and they looked up and saw this perfect formation of 30 Japanese Val, Zeros, and Kates flying over. And Buckmaster turned to Leslie and said, Max, I thought we shot all those sons of bitches down. So these planes took off, did the beautiful, well-done takeoff sequences that were fitted in with the Japanese sequences, and did a very good. When you see the first plane taking off, when Admiral Nagumo is watching, Diz Laird is flying that plane. It's really, really well done, down to the last detail. This is Diz piloting the Kate towards the what is Battleship Row in the movie. He was leading the first attack wave and dropping the torpedoes. He said, of course, the Battleship Row wasn't there. That was put in later. But they spent some 10,000 hours of flight time filming all of the attack sequences and the dogfights. But one of the more memorable sequences, some of them were not even scripted. The famous B-17 coming in one wheel up, that was not scripted. It turned out one of them could not get its wheel down, and the director Ray Kellogg said, "Okay, circle around, use up fuel. We're going to set up the camera. If you're going to belly in, we might as well film it." So if you watch that sequence very carefully and you see the plane come out of the cloud, the smoke, on one wheel, you can see that it's almost there. All four engines are going, and then it immediately cut to the moment it touches down. You'll notice that both of the right engines are shut off, and it skids in. It's a very nicely done landing. Did very little damage to the wing, but they decided to use it. There's one other shot in which the Japanese are strafing the line of P-40s at Wheeler Field. And all of these mock P-40s were built. They were of fiberglass, fabric, and wood. They're being shot to pieces, and one of them is trying to take off, and you see it coming towards the camera, and there's a bunch of stuntmen who are trying to get away. Well, that also wasn't quite scripted. It was supposed to crash into the line of fighters, but it went out of control. When you see those stuntmen running, they're not acting. They're running for their lives. That plane is out of control. But there's some really spectacular stuff. Tora 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 uses up quite a bit of the chapter on the Pacific War. It has a lot of detail that I haven't even gotten to, and it was fascinating to learn quite a bit about the detail of the movie. Great Waldo Pepper, my opinion, the greatest aviation movie ever made. Really a lot of fun. It's purely fictional. There was no Waldo Pepper, but they do such a good job with it. You almost want to check to see if there ever was a Waldo Pepper. They did a great job. George Royhill did a great job recreating the life of the barnstormers of the 1920s and how rough it was. He did what William Wellman did. He got real airplanes and real cameras and real pilots and filmed them in the air. The dogfight sequence between Waldo Pepper and the German ace Ernst Kessler, which was done, he was portraying someone like Ernst Udet. When they do that dogfight with the Fokker and the Southwest Camel, that's done the way it was done, with cameras in the air with them, showing them. Now, both of those are reproduction planes. The Fokker was flown by Jim Appleby, who died just before I started working on the book, but his widow was Zona, was a wonderful source of information about her husband's aviation film. This is really well done. There's only one odd historical note, is that the roundels on Waldo's plane are British rather than American. I've never found out why, but it does a great job of showing what life was like for airmen of that time. One stunt in the movie that's of note is when you see the plane flying down the street in a Texas town to promote a stunt show. That is not Hollywood trickery. That is really being done. That is Frank Tallman, one of the greatest of the Hollywood stunt pilots. He actually flew the plane down the street. He had 10 feet of clearance, and it was only about 8 to 10 feet up, and he flew straight down the middle of a street. It's an amazing stunt, even more so when you realize that Frank Tallman had lost one of his legs from an embolism years before, and he had a peg leg, and that's what he was controlling the plane with when he made this stunt. But it is a real stunt, and everything else, John Cadian, who was a Hollywood stuntman at that time, gave you a lot of information on how they actually filmed these stunts in the air and on the ground, and I think it's one of the best ever done. On the other hand, there's Midway. Now, I have to pick on this movie because Midway could have been great, and it's been recently done. I haven't even seen the new one yet. They used a lot of Tora 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 film footage, and sharp-eyed viewers will recognize that they used stuff from 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and a couple of other movies, and they spliced it all together. It had to be in color. And every blue plane looked like every other blue plane, so you'll often see pilots flying in VC-13 Valiants and diving in Dauntlesses or Hell Divers and pulling out in Panthers. It's a little sloppy, but one of the things that bothered me most about it is that because they didn't do as good on the writing as they might have. Cliff Robertson, who I got to know before he died, told me, he said that the writing in that movie was awful. He said, I did it just with a favor for the producer, but he said the writing was awful. To the point where, in order to keep the audience appraised of the story, they had to put the title cards in to describe what ships you were looking at. Well, this is the USS Lexington, but they reversed the shot and named it as the carrier Hiryu. So they did this all the way through the film, and it's a little annoying when it really didn't need it. You don't have to do that if you do better writing. But the shot where Tom Garth is flying his Wildcat, he's in a mock-up Hellcat cockpit, and he's flying a Wildcat, and he's been shot up, and he's trying to make his carrier, and he's burned, and he's grimacing, and then he comes in, and then he crashes, and you see the plane sliding across the deck and hitting one of the gun bunts, one of the gun tubs, and splits apart and spins around. We've all seen that shot. Well, that was in Peleliu in 1944. So it's not from the Battle of Midway. It's spectacular, but this is an example of it. And when his father, Charlton Heston, Matt Garth, crashes, he's crashing against the stern of the USS Midway, which is now here in San Diego, in an F-9F Panther, even though he had been flying a Dauntless dive bomber earlier in the film. So somewhere after making Airport 1975, he managed to perfect mid-air transfer. The Midway is not as good as it could have been, but when it came out in 1976, what did I know? I liked the movie. Blue Thunder was one of the first movies in which the aircraft became more of a star than Roy Scheider, the star itself. This is actually an Aerospatiale SA-34 Gazelle. It was owned by an oil company, and there were two of them, and they were modified and painted to look like this super helicopter with all this high-tech gadgetry on it and everything. Well, one of the myths about Blue Thunder is that the idea got around that you could not loop in a helicopter, but you can. I've talked to John Tellis, who was the pilot of Marine One, told me that he actually saw a pilot put a Sikorsky Sea King into a loop. It can be done. It's not impossible. It's just very tricky. But it's one of the things in the movie. Now, this helicopter, whenever you see this thing flying, you'll always notice that the nose is down because there's so much extra hardware. That is a real minigun on the nose, and it's very heavy. So it has quite a bit of weight, and it's impossible for it to fly absolutely level. But who cared? It was a cool helicopter, and it really looked good in the film. And it managed to shoot down a couple of F-16s over Los Angeles. Not one person on the ground was ever hurt. When you dogfight in high-tech aircraft over Los Angeles, you would think there'd be an incredible amount of damage on the ground, but it never seems to happen. Blue Thunder got to be such a hit for the public. It was one of the first real high-tech action films that in a Midwestern city, there was a town hall meeting between enraged citizens and the police helicopter division because they were complaining about the noise. And the police representative was explaining, we're going to try to find different ways of routing our planes so that we will not be disturbing you as much. And one man stood up, he said, hey, look, I saw that Blue Thunder movie. Why don't you just get that whisper mode and it won't be a problem? And the police representative smiled and said, sir, I'm sorry, but that's only available in Hollywood. And the man said, well, I don't care where you have to go to buy it, just get it. It's a good example of how much the public can be moved by movies like this and these kind of aircraft. Blue Thunder would have been an impossible plane to fly if it was real. And it did spark a very short-lived um, TV series and then a copycat series called Airwolf. Top Gun. This movie changed naval aviation in the 20th century because it was such a major hit. Um, Captain Rick Wig Ludwig, who's a friend of mine, who's a neighbor, actually only lived about a block from me when I first met him, commanded Top Gun shortly after the movie came out. He was an F-14 pilot, and he and his wife were packing their house in Virginia when they for his California assignment when he said, "Hey, I heard about this movie. Let's go check it out. Let's take a break." And they went to see the film, and he was sitting there on the edge of his seat, and he said, "Oh my God, my job is going to change." It certainly did, because suddenly being a naval aviator was the thing to be. Everybody wanted to be Maverick. Everybody wanted to be a naval aviator. Well, Tony Scott directed the film, and he did what William Wellman had done. He filmed in the air with real airplanes, real cameras, and real pilots. The dynamics were different because F-14s and F-5 are much faster than Curtiss Hawks. They did the filming from camera ships and did a lot of filming in the air, on the ground, and it really looked good. But let's be frank, Maverick would never have gotten into Top Gun. He was much too much of a hot dog and independent. They did not pick the top 1% of the top 1%. They did not award a trophy. They chose good, solid pilots who could train other pilots. Maverick would never have been allowed. And this next shot is a good example, the impossible shot. I've talked to several Tomcat and Hornet pilots. Not one of them would think that this was anything but ridiculous. These planes would have crashed into each other with at any moment because of their rudders would have been passing over each other. It's not possible. It's purely Hollywood fiction. And that barrel roll he does when the MiGs are shooting at him is also absolutely ridiculous. But it looks good on film, and it made it for a great shot. Now, that dawn sequence in which Tony Scott filmed the sun coming up on the dawn on board the Enterprise, he had it all set up. You're waiting for the sun to come up and silhouette the flight deck crew, when suddenly the ship turned around and headed into the wind. And he ran up to the bridge and said to the captain, he said, "You ruined my shot. I need 5 more minutes." And the captain said, "It'll cost $20,000 to turn this ship around." So Tony Scott wrote him a check for $20,000, and he got his 5 minutes. But Top Gun is, while largely fictional, it is technically accurate, and it is beautifully filmed. King Kong. There's a chapter in the book called On the Edge of Flight. It's just movies that have a little bit of an aviation sequence. 1933. Miriam Cooper, the director of King Kong, who would later go on to become Claire Chennault deputy flying with the Flying Tigers in China. He found a Curtiss OSC squadron, possibly in Los Angeles and possibly in New York. That's never been established which one, but he paid them each pilot $10 a day and $100 to the Navy Relief Fund to get them to film for this stuff. So the takeoff and landing, pretty much everything in the air is done with models, very detailed models of 14-inch wingspan, 24-inch, and 36-inch wingspan. This way, by using these models, he could force the perspective on the shot, the larger planes being close and the smaller ones being farther away. They're only a few feet, but it looks like there's miles between them, and it's really well done as they head at Kong. Now, there's one interesting shot in which you see the pilot and the gunner close up, and they are looking back and forth for wherever they're going to be shooting at. And the gunner swings around, and you see him tap the pilot on the shoulder, and he points down to the left. And you can hear him saying, almost exactly hear him saying, "Hey, no, it's the monkey on that building over there." That happens to be Ernest Schoenstack in the gunner's set. He was the producer of the movie, and Miriam Cooper is the pilot. in a commentary which turned up on the DVD many years later was, well, we figured we might as well shoot the son of a bitch down ourselves. So King Kong has some great sequences and early special effect wizardry. Raiders of the Lost Ark was a fun movie. It has a little bit of aviation in it. I'm not going to get into the flying wing part, but when Indy is going to go to China to find Admiral Ravenwood, he's taking the China Clipper across the Pacific. Well, there are no Boeing or Martin China Clippers left, but this aircraft is at the Oakland Aviation Museum, and it is in the water. It is a short Solent. And for this film, just for the startup sequence, that they managed to get one of the Hercules engines to work. And so when you see him climbing in there and then they start the engine, that's it. But that is as close as you're going to get to a real China Clipper for the film. That plane is still there. The other interesting plane earlier in the film is the Waco, or Waco, if you really want to get it right, a UBF-2, the float plane. This plane still exists. It's owned by a couple up in Oregon. This is the one when Indy is running away from Hobitos Indians because for some reason they're a little annoyed at him because he stole their idol, and they're trying to kill him. And he's running for the river, yelling, "Get it up, Jock, get it up." And Jock starts up the engine, and Indy jumps into the water, being chased by blowguns and spears. And he climbs in and gets in and finds himself sharing a cockpit with a snake. I don't know what a snake was when he was first brought to this place, but never mind. If you look closely at the registration number, you'll notice that it is OBCPO. That is a tongue-in-cheek respect from director Steven Spielberg to his USC alumnus, George Lucas. There's a chapter about comedy movies. One of my favorites is Keep 'em Flying, one of the early war, or just pre-war, Abbott and Costello films, along with Buck Privates Come Home and Here's the Navy. It was filmed at the Cal Aero Academy in Chino, what was at that time Ontario. It is now Chino, California, and it's the home of Planes of Fame. The Cal Aero Academy was where one of the early primary training sites for air cadets, and it was commanded by Robert Lee Scott. This was what he was doing when he was trying desperately to get across into the Pacific and go to join the Flying Tigers, and he was told he was too old. So he actually did some of the flying in the movie, and the one sequence in which you see Lou Costello get out of control in a PT-22 trainer, a Ryan PT-22 trainer, and his wings are sheared off, and he's careening around and through a hangar. That's Scott at the controls. He's actually flying. When the movie was released through the public in Hollywood, the date was November 26, 1941. As the people were sitting down to watch this movie, on the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese fleet was leaving Hitokapu Bay on its way to attack Pearl Harbor. It's a Mad, 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 Mad World also had some great aviation sequences. My favorite being with the Beech 18 flown by Buddy Hackett and Mickey Rooney with Jim Backus behind it. It was actually piloted by Frank Tallman again, just like in Great Walter Pepper. He did two really spectacular stunts, one in which he flies through a billboard and the other in which he flies through a hangar. These are not Hollywood trickery. He really did this, and it required great concentration and skill on his part. Remember, he only had one working leg. The billboard was at the end of the runway in what is now John Wayne Airport in Orange County, and it was made of very light wood and paper, and it was just large enough for the wingspan, the rudder, tail, and extended landing gear. and it had a bullseye painted on the back side of it. And he went through it with the propeller windmilling. He aimed himself directly, not the plane, but himself directly at that bullseye and flew through. The propellers stopped at the moment he hit, and he had to land. It was right at the end of the runway. But this was a real stunt. It only takes up 1.5 seconds of film time, but it's spectacular. The other major stunt he did was to fly through a hangar, and this was at Santa Rosa Airport. And at first, he was considering flying in and landing in the hangar, and then they would connect it with a shot of him taking off and flying out of the hangar. But after a few passes, he decided, I'm going to try it. And John Kasian told me, yes, he went through at about 165 knots. He went straight through. And the moment he came out, he had to pull up to avoid a line of trees. So he actually did this stunt. This was not trickery. When he landed, where the Three Stooges were waiting as part of the fire brigade, that was at the old Rancho Conejo Airport, which is no longer there. That's where that part was filmed. So it's worth seeing just for those sequences. That Beach 18. Okay, the last movie we'll cover will be Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It came out in 1964. This is one of the most interesting movies ever come out of the fertile and twisted mind of Stanley Kubrick. If you've seen this movie, I have yet to find a SAC veteran who will admit to seeing this movie, but it's really spectacular. Well done considering when it was filmed. The mock-up, the B-52 interior were done from photographs, and they did a very good job recreating it. But all of the interesting, fantastic characters, my favorite being Major King Kong by former rodeo rider Slim Pickens. They did some really good special effects, especially when Pickens is on top of one of these bombs. They were not given any pictures of what an airdrop nuclear weapon looked like, so they just made it up. It looked good. And when he falls out of it and he starts riding his way down into infinity, it's still a great shot. But there's an interesting moment in the film when he is still in the cockpit and describing what their attack profile is going to be and what their escape kit contains when they would have to, if they would have to be bailed out over Russia. And he's describing that. Now, one of the things is that he says, shoot, a fellow could have a pretty good time in Vegas with all that stuff. If you look at his lips, the word Vegas doesn't match. And that's the reason, because the original dialogue was, shoot, a fellow could have a pretty good time in Dallas with all that stuff. The reason they dubbed in the word Vegas was because while they were filming it, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and that was changed. Otherwise, the other part is that, and this is, I'm going to give you guys a test. The B-52 model they used was very detailed and very well done, and they used it for a lot of process shots. And while he is doing his going over the escape kit, this shot is being shown. I wonder if any of you can spot the incongruity about it. The plane looked great, but what do you see on the ground? I'll give you a moment, and I'll bet most of you have already spotted it. Well, there you go. That's a B-17 shadow. It was the B-17 being filmed over North Dakota sometime around the time of the war, probably out of a waste window. Well, they put in this the B-52 model in front of that shot. If you're not paying attention, you won't notice it. But if you are paying attention, it's very obvious. So these are just a few of the films and a story that I've always enjoyed telling. There's many, many more. And you'll find a lot more. 177 movies are detailed in Flying on Film, A Century of Aviation in the Movie, 1912 to 2012, which I wrote, and it was a 4-year project. With over 250 interviews with actors and aviators, military people, directors, historians, historians and other authors. It was an incredible, fun thing to do. It's definitely one of my favorite books, and I really enjoyed writing it. If you watch these movies, this is the book you want to have next to you. This is the book you want to stop the film and look up some of the trivia so you can watch for it. You can get it on Amazon.com. You can also get it through the publisher Sunbury Press. Or if you like to have an autograph copy, you can order one directly from me. I have several copies of them. I will be happy to autograph it and mail it to you directly, personalized. $25 plus $2.75 shipping and handling by check. Contact me at my home office at 858-472-5419. That's 858-472-5419. Or email me at markcarlson2222@outlook.com. I'll leave this slide up for a while. And if you just want to call and ask questions, or if you have a question about a particular movie, feel free to do so. You don't have to buy the book. I love talking aviation and movies. I'd be glad to hear from you. So again, that's Mark Carlson 2222, all one word, no spaces, all lowercase, at outlook.com. And I hope you enjoyed this talk and as much as I did, and I will be delighted to hear from you. And thank you very much for the Palm Springs Air Museum and Greg Kenny for setting this up. And I will be glad to come back anytime. You all have a great day and keep them flying.